Rav Kahane Zatzal was quite different from many people, including many rabbis, who sometimes prefer to tell Hashem what he meant, wrote something in the Torah. They give it their own spin, their own interpretation, because it fits their agenda, because they see the Torah as working for them. He knew that whatever Hashem demands of us, that is what we must do, and what we find difficult, or what we find perhaps even surprising about some of his commands or instructions, that's not in any way a reason not to do what Hashem wants us to do. We can have questions, but we cannot flinch from doing that which has to be done. This is one of the basic characteristics of any Torah true Jew, and this was definitely one of the major characteristics of Rav Kahane Zatzal. One of the things I can tell you about Rav Kahane, from my acquaintance with him, and I'm sure everyone who knew him will confirm this, is that he was unable not to hear the cry of his fellow Jew. Rav Kahane Zatzal, he was always thinking about Jews all over the world, in Israel, in Russia, in America, and he was also willing to think outside of the box. Everybody knew that there were Jews in Russia who were suffering and who couldn't escape Russia, but no one thought of doing those things that were totally outside of the box, like blowing up an Aeroflot office in New York, or doing sit-down demonstrations in the streets of Manhattan. Those kinds of things that would actually do something which are not easy to do. Something has to be done, but it's not easy to do. It's not easy to do things and get arrested, or to be thought of as a kind of an unpleasant person who breaks the law, who does the kinds of actions that a normal, decent, law-abiding citizen does not normally do. It's not easy to paint yourself in those colors, in that fashion. But that did not prevent Rav Kahane from doing that which had to be done, because he saw that this was the only way to draw attention to these issues, and he was right. Historically, we know that he was right. It had an effect even on the Soviet Union of that day, which was at its peak, and it had an effect on the Soviet regime to the extent they allowed a certain number, many thousands, I don't know the exact number, of Jews to leave the USSR at that time, as we know, in the early 70s. This is another central characteristic feature of Rav Kahane's life, his dedication to other Jews. Another point I wish to mention with regards to Rav Kahane Zatzal was his understanding, his very correct understanding, that the Jewish people had forgotten about something very simple and basic in Judaism, something called the Tanakh. Rav Kahane was always concerned, here in this yeshiva where I taught for a time, before he was assassinated for about 3 years. He always stressed in all his shiurim, and also when we went through, discussed with him the curriculum, he always stressed the importance of studying Tanakh. Why did Rav Kahane do this? Because he understood that the Tanakh is the core of Torah Judaism. And that core of Torah Judaism is only really suited and only really makes sense to Jews when they live in Eretz Yisrael, in this type of generation, a generation which is involved in rebuilding Eretz Yisrael and returning to Eretz Yisrael. The reason that the Tanakh was forgotten over time, to a large extent, in Chutz La'aretz, in the Galut, is because over time the dissonance between the Tanakh and the Galut becomes ever greater. When a Jew lives in Ukraine, in Hungary, or in Marrakesh, in North Africa, or in Taiman, eventually the connection between Yerushalayim and Beth El, and the different stories about the Jewish people's travails and struggles and sins and successes in Eretz Yisrael, all this fades away to such a great historical distance that it ceases to have any meaning to a Jew living a Galut-type reality. The language is strange to him also. Keep that in mind also. A simple fact. One of the reasons that Jews learned less and less Tanakh was because the language of the Tanakh was more and more difficult for them to understand. So the more the Jewish people drifted away from their natural habitat and their original language, the language of the Tanakh, the more difficult it was to relate to that book of the Tanakh. Rav Kahane Zatzal knew this very well, and therefore he insisted that here in this yeshiva, Tanakh be learnt every day in a serious way. A serious chunk of the day was set aside for study of the Tanakh. Bikiyut and Iyun, there were shiurim in Tanakh, which is not something, as we know, that we see today in most yeshivot. And by the way, it's not just yeshivot Harediyot, it's also true for most of the non-Haredi yeshivot. By and large, Tanakh is not learnt in a serious fashion. And this is entirely, by the way, not according to the halacha. The simple plain halacha, which Chazal state in Masechet Kiddushin, Daf Lamed, which appears in the Shulchan Aruch, Yoreh De'ah, says as follows, that a person, every person, whether in Galuth or not, has to study Torah on a daily basis, and that study has to be divided into shlish, shlish, shlish. Shlish b'mikra, shlish b'mishnah, shlish b'talmud, which means that a certain serious portion of the day, of the time that you have to study, has to be devoted to the study of Tanakh. This is not just an ideological position or a whim of Rav Kahane or somebody else. This is the halacha. But when the halacha doesn't fit the reality, and Jews eventually just sort of ignore the halacha. They can't live the halacha. They can't make it happen in their lives. But here in Eretz Yisrael, with our return to the land, return to our natural home, to our homeland, to our original ancestral language, we are able to connect with the Tanakh. And then we are also able to connect with the true core of Torah Judaism. These were all ideas and principles according to which Rav Kahane lived, and according to which he wished this yeshiva, the students of this yeshiva, to study and to essentially produce a new kind of Torah Eretz Yisrael. Torah Eretz Yisrael is the Torah which allows the Jewish people living in Eretz Yisrael to progress, to advance, and to attain that which Hashem wants us to attain. And for this, as I said before, one has to think out of the box, as Rav Kahane did in many situations. What do I mean by that? I mean to say that in the Galut, just as the Tanakh was learned less and less, certain modalities of halachic practice and thinking became more and more fixed, more and more entrenched, so that Jews in this part of the world, Ashkenazim, would behave or act in this way. Sfaradi Jews, Temani Jews would act perhaps in a different way. Different minhagim arose. And over time, the Jewish communities, who were like flotsam on the sea, being spread apart, taken apart from one another, being dispersed by the currents and the waves, would become more and more distant and different from one another. To imagine that you can take hundreds and thousands of Jewish communities from all over the world, from every corner of the globe, bring them together to Eretz Yisrael, and that everybody should continue as if they were still living in Minsk, Pinsk, or Dvinsk, or Marrakesh, or Sana'a, and that things will work out just fine, and the Jewish people will get their act together and know what they're supposed to be doing, that is a very, almost childish, certainly a very naive thought. That can't possibly work. We have to think outside the box. Torah Eretz Yisrael involves expanding our horizons, expanding our minds, expanding our halachic models also. Take, for example, the kind of stones we have on the footpaths, the sidewalks outside on the street. You know, these bricks that they fit together. If I take 10 of those bricks and I say to you, take 10 of these bricks and form them into a circle. It's not a hard thing to do. Anyone can take 10 bricks, form them into a circle, and say, here you go, circle. Okay. Now let's say I come along and I say, all right, here are another 2 bricks. I want you to add them to the circle. How are you going to do that? You can't add them to the circle. You have to break the current circle and start again. You have to reform the circle with these new additional elements. The Torah of Chutz La'aretz is the small circle of 10 bricks. The Torah of Eretz Yisrael is not a Torah of 10, and not even a Torah of 12. It's a Torah of tens of bricks, if you want to compare them in a relative way. In other words, the Torah of Eretz Yisrael, the Torah of Am Yisrael in Eretz Yisrael is a much more profound, much more majestic and broader concept and reality than the Torah of Chutz La'aretz. The Torah of Chutz La'aretz focuses on kashrut, on the Bet Knesset, on things of that nature. Anything to do with Eretz Yisrael, anything to do with how to run a Jewish state, even the concept that you have to have a Jewish state, all these things are forgotten. They all fall by the wayside. When you want to reintroduce these ideas into complete vision and understanding of Torah, you cannot do it based on the small circle of bricks that you had before. You have to take all these new elements, the ideas of Malchuth and Sanhedrin and Mikdash, and how the Jewish people in this day and age can and must establish a Torah based on Torah precepts and ideals. All that has to be incorporated, and how to reconstitute a Jewish people, not a collection of disparate Jewish communities who came from all parts of the world with different languages, different customs, different piskei halacha. How to integrate all of that into one whole, into a new circle, involves breaking the old circle and creating a new set of ideas and modalities of thought, which will allow us to advance in the direction that Hashem wishes us to advance, which is to be a Mnicheth Kohanim and a Goy Kadosh. For us to achieve that purpose, that aim, that destiny of ours, we have to learn, like Rav Kahane, to think outside of the box and to expand our circle. May Hashem give us the wisdom and the tenacity, the insight and the determination to get the job done.